Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm trying something a little bit different. I'm going to be making a bias cut dress using a free pattern that I downloaded from Mood Fabrics. And just a quick note, this is not a sponsored video. I just thought the pattern looked really interesting and I wanted to give it a try. And also, since this is my first time sewing a bias cut dress, there's going to be a few learning moments along the way, which of course I'm going to share with you guys the mistakes that I made and what I would do differently next time. So here, the first thing I'm doing is I'm piecing together the printed PDF pattern. And I'm doing this a little bit differently. In the instructions, they have you arrange the entire pattern together in the little diagram, but instead I'm going through and just constructing each piece separately. So there's a front bodice, a back bodice, front and back facing, and then a strap. So here I'm putting together the front bodice. I did cut the edges along the cut lines on the PDF for these, where you cut the side on the right and then the top of the paper. And then I'm just lining it up and putting it together. Once I put each piece together, I'm going to go ahead and cut it to the size that I want to cut it on. And I'll get all my pattern pieces cut. Once that's done, then I'm going to cut the pattern. The reason I did this is because there's a lot of pieces to this dress and I'd have to arrange it on the floor to cut it. And I just didn't feel like being down on the floor and being uncomfortable. And I don't have a large enough table. But if I cut each individual piece, then my table is nice, good enough size that I can do that. And most tables, I think, like a dining table or something, should be big enough for this dress. So here, when I did get the piece ready, especially for the front and back, I marked the line for the size that I want to cut on all the edges, like each side of the pattern, just because, you know, there's so many sizes on this and it's going to be really easy for me to lose track which line to cut, and I don't want one side to be cut to one size and then the other side to be cut to a different size. So I was trying to be very careful as far as how I cut this. That was just a little trick I used here. All right, now that I have all the pattern pieces assembled and ready to go, next up is going to be cutting the fabric. Now I know this is going to be tricky because I'm using a silk charmeuse, which, as you may know, it's quite slinky. So to keep it stable while I'm cutting, I'm going to sandwich it between sheets of pattern paper. So here I'm just folding my fabric into a diagonal because that's how we cut on the bias. I have 2.5 yards of the fabric, so I split it up into 2 1-yard pieces and 1 half-yard piece. So here's the first yard folded on the diagonal, and then I have a sheet of paper below it, a sheet of paper on top of it, and then I lay the pattern on top. And then I'm going to make sure that everything is still stable and good. And I've lined up the edge with the edge of the fold of the fabric, not the paper. Make sure it's lined up correctly with the fold of the fabric. And then of course, pin it down. I'm going to pin it down, make sure it's nice and steady. And then I'm just going to start cutting. Oh, and now make sure you don't use your fabric scissors to cut this because you are cutting paper. So here I'm using scissors that I use for paper and not fabric. And this is so much easier to cut, guys. I love cutting this way because while my fabric isn't moving and I can tell it's a perfect cut. So I would not cut this fabric any other way. Might be a waste, you know, you've got to use a lot of paper to do this, but you can recycle the paper, and I'm going to try to use as much of it as I can for the facing and the straps later too. All right, so I'm going to repeat this process for the back, the facing, and the strap. And once everything is cut out, I'll start sewing. Okay, now I have all of my pieces cut. I am going to take the front piece, and the step number 1 is to stay stitch along the neckline. And the reason we do the stay stitch, and this is in the instructions as well, is so your neckline does not stretch over time. So make sure you do this step. So I'm just going to do a plain regular 2.5 stitch length. And now when I sew this fabric, be careful not to pull or stretch it. Just let the fabric glide through the machine because it is very delicate. And the fabric I'm using is extremely slinky, and I want to make sure that I just let it naturally flow under the feet of the machine, and I'm not pulling in any way, not in the front or back. So just make sure you do that. All right, now that I have the neckline stay stitched, I'm gonna move on to the next step. So the next step, I'm gonna take the back piece and I'm gonna pin it together with the front on the sides of the fabric, and we're gonna just base stitch it. So I'm gonna use a 5, a length, I'm gonna set it to a 5 probably, maybe even a 6, because I want to easily remove this. Because what I want to do for the side seams, and this is not in the instructions, I'm gonna do French seams on the sides because the French seam is much nicer on this lightweight slinky fabric. So I'm just pinning it together, making sure I'm lining up the edges nicely, and then I'll go to my machine and baste it. And then what I'm gonna do after you baste it, you wanna hang it for a few hours, maybe a couple of hours, to let that bias to rest and to settle. So once you've done that, then I'm gonna come back. I'm actually gonna let mine hang for a day, and I'm gonna come back tomorrow and finish this. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and demonstrate how I constructed the side seams of the dress. I've already done it on my dress, but I'm gonna show you guys how I did this with a different fabric. What I used was a French seam, and this is perfect for finishing raw edges and giving your dress a nice professional look. It looks cleaner and it's really nice on lightweight fabrics. All right, let's go over how to construct a French seam. So I've got two pieces of fabric with the wrong sides facing each other. And I know this is kind of counterintuitive because usually we have the right sides facing each other, but for a French seam, we have the wrong sides facing, so the right side is facing up. I'm going to pin them together, and for the sample, I'm going to stitch very close to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch, but let's say your garment requires a 1/2 inch seam allowance. What you'll do is you'll stitch about 1/4 of an inch, straight stitch, and then you'll trim down that stitch to about 1/8 because you want to reduce the bulk when you fold it over. And you'll see here after I stitch this what I mean. So for the bias cut dress, it did require a 1/2 inch seam allowance. On that dress, I did do a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, then I trimmed it down, and then I came back and stitched it at 1/4 inch. So here I've stitched that 1/8 of an inch, and then I'm gonna go ahead and press it to the other side. So now I'm facing the fabric's right sides together. So you're gonna fold it along that edge where you just stitched, and make sure you press it so you don't have too much in the fold. Once you have a nice crisp fold, I'm going to come back to my machine, and now I'm stitching at 1/4 of an inch. So you want that seam allowance inside the stitching. You don't want it to stick out. So now that I've had it, I've got this beautiful finish. Now you can see there's no raw edges showing. And now I'll go back to my iron and I can just press that seam to one side. And this is exactly how I constructed the bias dress with the silk charmeuse. I went ahead and I did a seam finish, French seam finish on the sides of the dress. All right, so next up is gonna be the straps of the dress. I've already constructed one. So you're gonna take your fabric and you're gonna stitch it about 1/4 of an inch or less, actually, almost halfway. And now in the instructions, they ask you to trim this down. I'm not trimming it down because the bulk will help. You want the bulk inside your strap. It'll make the strap a little bit thicker, especially with this really lightweight fabric. So I'm just gonna stitch it, fold it in half, and then stitch it about the middle of the strap. And then I'm using a loop turner to turn this over to the other side. It's a little bit tricky, but once you get it, it's like magic. It just turns over really nice. So I've cut 1 inch to a diagonal like this. Then I put the loop turner and I take that diagonal edge and it's got this little piece that you can pierce the fabric through, so you could basically pin the fabric on the edge of this loop turner here. And then what I'm gonna do once I do that is I just kind of start wrapping it over that thing. And now the little circle, I just put it on the edge of my machine and I'm gently pulling this to turn it over. It takes a minute, but once you get it going, it's really flows nicely. And you can get these loop turners on Amazon or, you know, at a Joann's Fabric or something. And there you go. I've got my other strap turned over. Now I'm just going to go ahead and press my straps so they're nice and flat. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my front and back facing prepped and ready to attach to the dress. So I'm going to attach them together or stitch them together, and it does give you the seam allowance here. But before I do that, I'm going to use my pinking shears to go ahead and pink the edges of this because I don't want to finish it on a serge or anything or an overlock. I rather just pink them. I think it's going to lay a little bit nicer just because the fabric is so delicate. So let's go to the machine and stitch these two together. All right, now that I have my facing stitched together, I'm going to go ahead and pin it to my dress, and you're going to pin right side of the dress to the right side of the facing. Make sure it's right sides facing and just carefully make sure you match the edges and then the side seams, and you're going to pin the straps inside the facing like this. So just carefully go through, pin it, and then we're going to go to the machine and I'm going to stitch at a 1/4 inch all the way around, and make sure you also take your strap around because we're going to be putting it in the back also, and you should have notches where those straps go. On the front, it's easy, it goes right here, but on the back, you gotta match it with the notches that you cut on the facing and of course on the back of the dress as well. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and very carefully stitch all the way around, and I'm gonna stitch at about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. All right, now that I have the facing attached to the dress, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew an understitch, which basically is the stitch that secures the facing to the seam allowance. You press the seam allowance and the facing up and away from the from the dress, and then you sew the understitch really close to the seam where you stitched it. And then once you're done, you'll just press it. So let's just go to the machine and I'm going to go ahead and start understitching. So here I'm gently going to pull the two pieces, and I'm making sure that the seam allowance is under the stitch, so it's towards the facing and not on the dress side of the fabric. And then when you get close to the shoulder seam area, you don't have to force it and go all the way up to the shoulder. You just go as close as you can. You really don't need to finish it off all the way to the edge. Go where you can, don't force it, and just go as far as you can on these edges, and then back you'll stop, and then when you start over, do the same thing. Just get as close as you can, but don't force it. All right, now that we have this nice, beautiful facing, it looks really good, we're gonna go down and do the hem. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my machine and I'm gonna stay stitch this at 1/4 inch all around the hem area. All right, now that I have my stay stitch on the hem, I came back and I'm just pressing my facing at the top, and then I'm gonna press the hem allowance where I stay stitched towards the inside as well. And then I'm gonna go to my machine and I'm gonna roll it in and do a stay stitch rolled hem on the edge of this dress. And then we're done. The dress is done. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. It looks lovely. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys try to make this dress. And if you have any comments or suggestions, if you like the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and come visit often and make suggestions. I love making these videos. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.